the weirdest people in the world, how the West became psychologically peculiar and particularly prosperous. A lot of P's in the end there. I struggled a little bit with that one, but
Good
here
alliteration.
it is. That's what a red book looks like for all you guys listening to the podcast. Okay,
Hell yeah.
you got to read it, and you got to highlight it. You got to draw on your books. Come on, get in there, get dirty with it.
It's a really good book.
It is a good book. I was reading it on the beach in Brazil, and I'm just like getting up from the beach, being like, "Can you believe this?" Like,
yeah.
These towns, you can tell how fast a town walks based on when their clock was installed in the Middle Ages. The earlier the clock was put in the town square, the faster the people walk today. This is insane, you know?
Yeah. It's amazing.
Welcome to the Books Brothers podcast, where we break down the most important books in history, science, and philosophy.
We are on a journey to explore the world through my personal favorite medium, books. I'm JD.
I'm Andrew. And on today's episode, we're covering Joe Henrich's groundbreaking exploration of how culture and psychology intertwined to create the modern Western mind. The book is called Weird.
He has the best historical analysis, like poring over Catholic records and then going into studies about, individualism and literacy and when they developed a representative government and everything. One of the only books we've ever read where they take history and analyze it quantitatively, which was really, really cool. I don't think any other book I've read has done it in such a clear picture. You get tastes of it in other books, but this one is just like, bam, dates, scores on all these various psychological tests, and they're just all super correlated.
It's Martin Luther was like, hey, you got to read the Bible yourself to get it. And that literally changed the entire world because now everyone can read, and that it changes the way your brain works. I'm like, oh my gosh. And you can tell how smart the people in a town are by how close they are to Martin Luther's town of Wittenberg, Germany. Like, the closer you are to Wittenberg, Germany in 1500 whatever Martin Luther year, when he had a nice hammer and a nice nail there, dude, the closer you are, the smarter you are in your town. It's crazy, dude.
Higher rates of literacy. I wouldn't say IQ.
Yeah. Half of the graphs in the book, the x-axis is like percent cousin marriage, by the way, which is just hilarious, dude. It's like everything is like, the more cousin marriage, the less weird you are. You know what I mean? It was like a funny way. Yeah, it was like, banger of a book. Thanks, Joe Henrich.
Joe Henrich, man. This is a first author. We've done 2 books of this guy, written 2020. And it turns out Secret of Our Success was supposed to be chapter 1 of this book.
Yep, I saw that.
Which is really cool to extend a whole chapter 1 into a whole book. And it kind of makes sense to do that one first. And then this one, also super influential for Righteous Mind. Like a whole chapter of Righteous Mind was about how weird we are and our psychology and everything. So obviously Haidt was reading him. Fukuyama was reading his papers. I mean, all the stuff about Catholic cousin marriage. It's a big book.
He's in the center of the dartboard of the Brother Books. He's a professor of biological anthropology. You know what I mean? It's just like, it's that perfect combo of biology, anthropology, culture. I would say like Brother Books, dude, our season 1 was like, had a selfish gene about all we are is genes, and like we evolve as like genes only. And then, dude, this guy is like super anti-Dawkins, where he's like, no, we evolve as culture. And he's like, he seems to me to be one of the leading culture evolving guys.
Disagree, because he's saying that we evolve on top of our genes. Like, he probably doesn't fully agree with he's not anti-Dawkins.
But Dawkins is super anti-Henrich. Dawkins is like, it's genes only. There's absolutely nothing but cultural evolution. It does not exist. You're stupid. We're 2 brothers, 8 cousins. The end. Like, that's dude.
We'll get him on the podcast to talk about it.
Dude, you don't need to, dude. Just get on X and Google Doc, and he's such a about this, dude. He's crazy. Joe, whatever. We're on the team Joe Henrich, the team John Haidt, the team Culture Evolves as well, on top of genes.
He's anti-group evolution, and Henrich is cultural evolution, and those are subtly different. I think it would be a complicated debate between the two of them. I don't think Henrich is fully anti, but let's get back to the book.
Dude, Rise of States, Northwest Europe, kind of won overall. We all agree. Like, The world kind of agrees. China and India have something to say about it right now, but like clearly US is on top. That came from Northwest Europe. Joe Henrik is like, why? You know? And that's kind of like, so this is a nice little cherry on top to the Rise of States season 2. Weird, JD, is an acronym. And what he's really pointing out, and the main, juice of this book is like, we evolved culturally in Northwest Europe. And we evolved in such a way that it changed the way that our brains work. And that cultural evolution that eventually became cerebellum evolution, like it changed our brains, that's the reason that Western Europe, quote, won the world.
I like neuroscience too much to give you the cerebellum, because that's movement related brain, but we'll just go brain overall.
Brain overall, deal.
Yeah, and one thing, I don't think he ever uses this word, maybe he does, but this was the word that stuck with me, is that the culture over the last 1,000, 2,000 years developed a psychological architecture that changed. So he's like, our genes aren't exactly changing. It's just that the way we're using our genes change to give us a bit of extra juice. And he actually opens the book talking about how literacy changes the brain and strengthens the connections between our hemispheres, moves some of the facial recognition towards scribbles on a page recognition. He's just kind of outlining or just setting up the whole theme of like, the environment doesn't change the genes that you're given, it just changes the way that they're expressed and changes the development of your brain. Because he makes a point like
epigenetics, by the way, epigenetics. Yep,
1,000 years ago, China and the Islamic world were way on top, and that Islamic scholars were writing about the barbarians in the north, and they're talking about the Dutch and the British, and then 1,000 years later, and talk about the shift that's gone on. And so the architecture, the new cultural environment that developed in Northwest Europe is what laid the groundwork, quote, gradually laid the groundwork for the rise of, this is a good sum up for the whole book.
Good. This is it.
Impersonal markets, urbanization, constitutional governments, democratic politics, individualistic religions, scientific societies, and relentless innovation. That's like the last chapter on innovation. In short, these psychological shifts fertilize the soil for the seeds of the modern world.
So he's calling literacy's kind of kicked off a psychological shift. JD called it a rewiring of our psychological architecture. I called it, update to the cerebellum infrastructure. How about cranial construction? Maybe a little building some new brain bridges there for you. Okay. And dude, let me just throw a little spice on top of your like excellent quote. But like, when I read this, I like told everyone, it's in like chapter 3 or 4 or whatever. I just told everyone that I was like sitting next to. I'm like, I can't, dude, 10% of the world's marriages today are people married to their cousins, their first cousins, dude.
Yeah.
And that's like, it's like a hot take highlight point about how weird the Western Europe cranial construction, psychological architecture is, that we think that cousin marriage is like abhorrent and scary and weird and like creepy. The rest of the world is like, yeah, that's totally fine. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
and so,
that's
like,
how it's supposed to go.
That's what, it's you marry your cousin. That's great. So, and we haven't actually hit it yet, but like we learned the weird acronym first from John Haidt, Righteous Mind, Brother Book, Season 1, Episode 2, fire episode.
Yeah.
Weird is an acronym for Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. That's sort of their branding of like what makes the Northwest Europe people like different psychologically from the rest of the world.
And talk about great branding. I mean, because I listened to interviews with him and he's like, we needed a way to like get this idea out to people, basically saying everything we've ever studied has been undergraduates in weird societies. It's not even like just like a slightly different. He's like, we're on the extreme end of a whole bunch of psychological traits. And so we need one idea that captures it. And so we'll just start with this chapter 1, weird psychology, Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. We have certain traits, high rates of individualism, much more analytical thinking as opposed to holistic thinking, and very low conformity, which is unlike everybody who has ever lived. We focus on ourselves and our attributes and our beliefs, not our group attributes and where we sit in a group. So we talked about this in Righteous Mind. You ask people, I am, fill in the blank, and weird people, I am a musician, I am an artist, I'm an entrepreneur. Basically everywhere else, and including our entire history, it would be like, I am a son, I am a husband. It's all how you fit into the wider holistic world. We see ourselves as unique. We're not nodes in a social system. We're more trusting of strangers. We, quote, fetishize abstract principles over context, practicality, relationships, and expediency. So abstract principles kind of suffuse the way we think rather than, oh, this person did this and this relationship to this person, therefore this or that.
Well, yeah. So I think the abstract principle that we most covet in the weird societies is like individualism, right? That's kind of that is what makes us so much more different from the rest of the society.
We miss forests for the trees. We're looking at individual trees. We're talking species and stuff. They see forests. Everybody in our history sees forests. We pass the marshmallow test higher rates than other people. And then here's a big one that's been studied for a while, apparently. We are a guilt-based society where everywhere else is more shame. So we don't feel shame if our daughter elopes with someone of a different race. We feel guilt if we watch TV instead of going to the gym, even though no one will know. That's the crazy thing. Like, we hold ourselves to these principles, but we don't care about what our daughter does because she's an individual.
Yeah, and that guilt versus shame thing was really interesting. And also, like, it's going to wrap up later in the book, but like, what is guilt? What religion is guilt? It's Catholic. You know what I mean?
It is
like
kind of
the
funny.
weird,
I don't think that's super like. I mean, maybe it is. I mean, Catholic guilt obviously is a thing. He doesn't actually mention the word Catholic guilt.
Yeah, he doesn't. But I'm mentioning it like because you can sin by yourself, but like not technically if you're like one of these sort of more, kin-based societies. It's like sin is like, you bring shame on your family versus like I feel guilty for eating that, Twix or whatever. So
that individualism means that we have to attract friends and mates and business partners all on our own. It's like a treadmill. We're Tinder swiping jobs and we're Tinder swiping cities and we're looking for our true selves. And that is weird. Nobody would think, why did you move there? Oh, I think this place represents my innermost being, and clicks with me. That would not make sense to anybody else.
And this is, I think the overall point here is like, JD, you and I, we're trying to understand the world as we all are. And like the weird is like a lately evolving 1500s on like evolved brand of human. He's like, if you want to understand all of us, you got to go pre-weird. And that's where we all came from. And that's where most of the world still is. Right. So that's kind of why we're spending so much time on this.
Here's a really good, we're setting the stage for, and then we'll go back in history. And then here's one of my favorite studies at the UN headquarters in Manhattan. It's on my 3D map.
Dude, this is crazy. This study was, I got the graph in the book right here. It's crazy. Yeah, but explain it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's good. Dude, there's so many good graphs. Apparently, we can't charge diplomats from other countries with minor crimes, like they don't get parking tickets. I don't know why, there must be some diplomatic reason for that. So they studied which countries get the most parking tickets, and it's non-weird countries like Chad or Nigeria had thousands of unpaid parking tickets. You see the guys like, I am fucking immune as hell, I do not care. And England, Sweden, and Germany had 0 parking tickets. Like those guys are just, we got to be respectful. We have abstract principles that we adhere to, and it doesn't matter if we're in our country or America.
The graph in the book is corruption index is the x-axis of country, and the y-axis is percentage of higher parking tickets. And it's just straight up. The more corrupt you are, the more parking tickets you got. It's like hilarious, dude. Yeah. All right.
That's a pretty high correlation. Another study, your friend is driving and your friend hits a pedestrian. Now, weird people would adhere to the abstract principle of truth-telling and justice, and we would testify against our friend. Like, yep, Andrew killed that pedestrian. And non-weird societies would think that is very weird, that he's your brother. Testify against someone you don't know. You don't testify, like... The principle we're adhering to is our relationship in the node in the social network that we inhabit and the connection that we share.
And so our principle would be truth. The non-weird society's principle would be kinship, right? Family.
Yeah.
Different principles sort of taking over the top spot in the deposition of that crime, right?
Here was another study that I liked. You have a bag in an airport and a guy either steals your bag or accidentally takes your bag because it was the same black bag as his and he didn't even mean to. And you ask people, obviously we think that his moral intentions and his like moral state mattered, was relevant to whether he's convicted of a crime. But to non-weird people, quote, they put relatively little importance on mental states is probably how most people would have made moral judgments of strangers over the last 10 millennia. Like, it's the same outcome. Your bag's gone. That's all we're seeing is the outcome and the holistic picture of that guy took your bag. What else do you want to know? Nothing else to know.
That's kind of to today. I mean, premeditated murder in the first degree, second degree, accident murder. You intended to do it. Like, it's all that mental state stuff where pre-weird people, it's like, you murdered. Doesn't matter. Like, it's the same crime, you know?
So here's a big quote. I think we're summing up, the weird psychology quote. When thinking analytically, people zoom in on and isolate objects or component parts and assign properties to those objects or parts to explain actions. If a population became more inclined toward analytic thinking and the use of intentions in moral or legal judgments, how might that influence the subsequent development of law, science, innovation, and government?
Very Origins of Political Ordery, Francis Fukuyama.
Yeah.
Dude, we're going to get into a lot of ancient city as well, like kind of like the formations of cities and basic religions. This book covers a lot of season 2.
Yeah.
But right now we got the psychological complex of self-focused, individualistic, non-conforming, patient-trusting, intention-obsessed type brand of human.
Yeah.
We're hyper-protective of the stuff that we own. We're overconfident in our own individual abilities. We feel personal guilt more than group shame. We defer to elders and tradition less. That's how we're different than the rest of the world.
Yeah, and so that's falling out in the research. And he's like, wait a second, all these studies we've been doing the last 100 years are all on this group of humans, which happen to be super outliers. So how did this stuff happen? And just like Fukuyama, I mean, because I'm guessing Fukuyama read Henrik's papers, that Henrik basically points to the Western Catholic Church, and that's kind of the big like root of causality in this whole picture. And it's obviously more complicated, but that's the one chunk that has like the highest causal influence. He says that the church, quote, inadvertently altered people's psychology by promoting a peculiar set of prohibitions and prescriptions about marriage and the family that dissolved the densely interconnected clans into small, weak, and disparate nuclear families. So this is how you get guilds and charter towns, law courts, free markets, and universities, which we are going to get to in a later chapter. So I think we're skipping chapter 2 because that's basically Secret of Our Success. Go listen to our podcast on Secret of Our Success, link in the corner.
Chapter 3, clans, states, and why you can't get here from there. We're going to start with this tribe called the Ilahitaje. Where they're in Papua New Guinea, I think?
Papua New Guinea. And so basically why we focus on this tribe to start is every other tribe in Papua New Guinea has around 300 people. It's kind of the Dunbar number, max out. And, you go into the next valley, another group with 300 people speaking a different language. But the Ilahita had 10x that number. Okay, they have like 3,000. So that's an order of magnitude that stands out in the record. So they go finding in what's going on there.
Dude, if you're a cultural anthropologist and you find a bunch of tribes that can't break the Dunbar number, 300, and then you get one right next to them that just totally smashed it, you're like, holy shit.
Yeah,
like, we got to look at this guy. Like, they broke Dunbar.
Let's zoom in.
Let's figure out why. So why did they break it?
It's basically, simplifying, but religious norms and rituals. So then he goes through a couple examples of the religious norms and rituals that they developed that, help them scale up. One, this is a big one. If you're a boy, you have to go through rites of terror.
Big one.
This is just crazy. Your uncle cuts your penis, and you have to kill someone from another tribe. So, quote, experiencing terror together forges powerful memories and deep emotional connections that bind participants for a lifetime. And someone from other tribes helps keep their numbers down too. And, we person together, bam, we're in it for life.
Quote, uncle slicing your hurts a lot. End quote. Okay.
Yeah.
Dude, that's crazy, dude.
Yeah, that is pretty crazy. And that's also, so I'm going to go on a little Indo-European side note because that's the most incredible culture that has ever swept through, and 80% of the world's population speaks a language descended from them. This is from The Horse, the Wheel, and Language. I love our 3-list titles. They found a site somewhere in Ukraine or something where a ritual bonfire full of weed and male wolf skeletons. So what the hell do you think was going on there? These guys were getting faced and eating male wolves with the boys. Like, talk about a psychological, you think they're killing people and cutting their hell yeah they are. You know?
Dude, after this podcast, I got a great idea for a camping trip, by the way.
Yeah. Dude. Let's get some male wolves. I mean, you know, you're infusing their essence. You're like, your brain is all like, what? I'm like baked out of my mind. What's going on? Your uncle is beating you up, probably. You're gonna toughen up and you're gonna go off and kill some other people.
And you're gonna fight for your group now. Like, you are your group, dude. We got
for sure
together and ate wolf skeletons. Like, oh, we're a team.
Yeah,
you know,
that's like my favorite archaeological site ever. Wow. So back to the Ilahita, very similar to the Ilahita. The religious norms too help them scale up. Everyone in the tribe comes together and builds a giant building and performs whatever rituals they do in that building. And then here's the main thing. So in other tribes, when shit goes wrong, like your son dies of a snake bite or there's a drought or whatever, you always, chances are you're going to blame it on someone you don't like their witchcraft, their sorcery. Unbelievably common in history to, you know, blame things on people you don't like. But in the Ilahita, when stuff goes wrong, they ritual harder. Okay, we got to bring it together. We're clearly failing the gods. Let's get in that building and let's turn it up a notch. You know, let's get together and, you know, build some camaraderie. What a way to scale up your society and build the group cooperation and impersonal pro-sociality.
Quote, consistent with much psychological research on rituals, Tuzine's ethnography suggests that these mutual obligations and joint projects built emotional bonds among individuals, and most importantly, in the context of the Ilahita, across clans, end quote.
Here's the cool thing about that is that a lot of these beliefs came from another society that dominated them 100 years ago. And so the whole point of this book is this is cultural evolution. You know, this isn't like one group's different than another group. It's that different groups stumble on beliefs and practices and norms, and then they start dominating other places. They develop, you know, they make some changes. So like apparently that other group did some other things that weren't as effective in the long run, where the Ilahita took the good parts and added some good parts or whatever, and then they came up with something that lasted longer. But I mean, come on, you're still only 3,000 people. You know, there's lots of variation to do to bring it to another level.
It's sort of like we're talking about cultural evolution, and it becomes you got to have the best gods and your god, and it's almost like a spiritual evolutionary battle for like the spirit gods, and then like the bigger and stronger your god can be, that's what creates bigger groups, which eventually makes your cultures more survivable. So it is this weird battle.
So in agriculture, like we talked about a lot in Origins of Political Order, is it's basically the state versus the kin group and family, and the less power in your kin group, the more powerful the state and the more the society can scale up. He's actually saying that a lot of hunter-gatherer societies are relatively weird in the sense that their kin groups are just a much more small and local, and that it doesn't play this giant, you're not part of like a huge clan or whatever, where when you develop agriculture, you are holding valuable land that can be stolen, and you're holding grain in a giant pile that can be stolen. And the only way to like scale up the effectiveness of your agriculture is to buckle down on kin group dynamics. So like the agriculture actually accelerates the rise of clannishness in our cultural evolution. And so like, you know, 5,000 years ago, you're in huge groups of people that like, we're this, they're that, you know, the us versus them basically gets 10x'd over agriculture.
Quote, ancestors become supernatural agents demanding rituals and making clan land sacred. These elements of intensive kinship create dense networks of interdependent relatives, end quote. And the way we're kind of drawing it out, we just said it, you know, our ancestor gods become the gods of the tribe. our tribe gets a little bit bigger. We become gods of the village. Our village is getting better. Now we take over another village, become the city gods. The city gods, we get a big city going. Like that's the cultural evolution story. And just a quick callback to Ancient City, which I think might be the best book of season 2, Brother Books. Go check it out. Books Brothers. I always forget the name of our podcast. The ancient man was religion. Like there was no like, oh yeah, we go to church on Sundays. It was like everything was religion for ancient man. And so like, everything was honoring my ancestor. Like my Genesis story, if I'm an ancient man, was my ancestors, right? Like that's clearly where I came from. And so it's like, don't ever underestimate the power of religion in the mind of ancient man. And, which if that city beats our city, their gods must have been better. So I'm going to go follow their gods because their gods are better than my God because my God got beat by their God, so it was like that.
Yeah, there's an author I like, Tom Holland, I think they're the biggest history podcast out there, Rest is History. He makes a point that thinking of separating secular, even the word secular is super modern and super weird. Like nobody would have ever separated those two things. Just like when there's a drought, it's not because of the air currents, it's because of you or this or what, something more spiritual.
We're talking about sort of the buildup from nuclear families to clans to tribes to villages to cities. Quote, in consolidating various ritual powers, a chiefly clan gains control over the male initiation rites that lie at the core of age-set institutions. With this leverage, chiefs can deploy the warrior age grade as a tightly bonded army regiment that must obey the chief clan.
Yeah, so we're scaling up to a chiefdom. He's describing chiefdoms, and what makes a chiefdomship is basically owning the rituals and the rites, like whoever's the most powerful will own or be the conduit through which we do these rituals or that ritual. And then what's one of the rituals that's commonly correlated with military power? It's owning the wolf eating, getting together. Like, yeah, you want to send your boys to us because we're going to turn them into men. We'll cut their penises up. We're going to bring them back to you. Real fighters, So it's like whoever owns those rituals is usually the people that are kind of in charge of the whole clan or the chiefdom.
There's a section of the book, we don't have it here in the outline, but I remember him talking about sort of the age set institutions of like, they were setting like, 10-year-olds do this, 11-year-olds do that. And like when you're, the 13-year age class, that's when you go to the wolf eating cutting party. You know what I mean? Like that's, dude, it kind of reminds me of like 6th grade, 7th grade, 8th grade. Like, you know what I mean?
100%.
Like
those are age set institutions. And that's kind of a level of cultural sophistication in the sense that we're bringing enough people together that we're going to separate them out. If your group's 300 people, you're just kind of hanging out, this family, that little kid, it's just much more loose. And so that's when you get to chiefdomships, is when you're separating out those age groups.
Ritual is what binded these bigger and bigger groups, having rituals where we all get together.
Shared experiences, norms, taboos, shared identity, military hierarchy, conflict resolution, tax collection, property rights. These are all examples of things that as you scale up beyond maybe 3,000 or so, your group's going to have to start doing or it's going to collapse.
Chapter 4, the gods are watching. Behave.
If you guys are liking what we're doing, if you like the content, send it to a friend, like and subscribe. We're a growing channel. We love seeing the comments. We love every new subscriber. So we just wanted to take a moment to appreciate you being here, and back to the show.
Jay, you do a hit and run. I do a hit and run. Are you calling me out, or are you lying for me? What's it gonna be?
I'm thinking about what you're going to do too, because if I had killed someone, I'd be like, would he turn, part of me says yes, part of me says no. And part of me would debate, he's my brother, I love him. And part of me would be like, I like justice. I like living in a society with justice.
Dude, your justice. I don't want to go to jail. What are you doing? Yeah. Dude, but I get it too. I would be like, dude, the facts are you killed the guy. Like, what do you want me to say, bro?
Yeah.
The engineer says that your car killed that guy.
I told you to stop drinking. Yeah. I told you shouldn't be behind the wheel. You said, you, I can drive,
Oh, I hope we never have to deal with that, Jay. But you know what? Our friend Chris in Africa over here, he says, dude, you're crazy if you turn in your brother. Who cares what the truth is? He's your brother. You're insane, right?
I'm not turning my brother. If one of you guys was driving the car and I was in the car and you guys hit somebody, I'm keeping my lips zipped. Maybe it's being in Africa for almost 8 years, but you got to take care of each other, man.
So Chris, you have become less Western and educated, industrialized, rich and democratic. That might be good for your family in Africa, but that might not be as healthy for growing a strong society and a future successful state. If the DMV's, handing out IDs to their buds, that's...
And Chris or his family isn't gonna benefit exactly in the here and now from his adherence to these abstract principles at all. It's kind of like a giant civilizational marshmallow test of can we adhere to these principles that don't help anyone in the short run, but really help us in the long run? And that's what's amazing. And that's what this book is answering is how the hell do you start something like that off? How do you make millions of people think about justice and truth-telling and our mental states for these crimes, and get them all to believe these things that, hurts their families, which speaking of, how do we do that? It's by big gods.
We got Machiavelli.
Friend of the show.
Great quote. 1530. Friend of the show, Machiavelli. We love you, bud. 1531, quote, "It will also be seen by those who pay attention to Roman history how much religion helped in the control of armies, in encouraging plebes, in producing good men, and in shaming the bad. And truly, there never was an extraordinary institutor of laws among a people who did not have recourse to God, because otherwise he would not have been accepted."
Basically, yeah, Machiavelli being the student of human nature, is that was doing a lot of heavy lifting back then, the gods. And those were kind of shitty gods too. They were off doing whatever they wanted to do. They were impersonal, they were lying, they were cheating, they were stealing, but still they had that causal power to combine and force people to cooperate. Big God, I like to call it. Similar to Big Pharma, Big Brother. I like doing big God, big religion. It's good for norms, helps groups scale up. He says that small scale gods are similar to people, and they're kind of morally concerned. This is like Zeus and Jupiter even, the smaller scale, just a little god for our group. But those gods are mostly worried about themselves. Think of how much drama there's been between the Greek gods. They're always fighting, they're sleeping with each other, they're backstabbing each other. And think about that versus the Holy Trinity. The Father isn't annoyed at his Son. He's not venting to the Holy Spirit. We think of the Holy Trinity and our big God as just being one and eternal and perfect and whatever. That is a weird thought for in general history.
That's a great sort of a draw out. All the gods pre Jesus Christ and were just kind of amplified people with their own drama.
Well, it's because they were, like we say, they were probably based on our ancestors, so they weren't this huge, big, omnipotent force.
Yeah.
And they were more oh, it's a drought. He was probably annoyed or he probably forgot. Let's try to remind him to bring rain, where it takes a whole switch in mindset to think this is what God wants or whatever, It's a very big shift.
And a lot of the early gods too were just ancestor gods, and we would almost, in our family, we'd protect our gods, our ancestor gods, our neighbors can't know our ancestor gods, they, ours are better, so it was not only that's the universalizing, proselytizing aspect of Big J Jesus over here and his God.
Big J.
Quote, Big J, quote, "A fundamental question is, how did these weak, whimsical, and often morally ambiguous gods ever evolve into big, powerful moralizers of modern religions? How did morality ever get all tied up with supernatural beings, universal justice, and the afterlife?" End quote.
What does he say?
Competition, that's how. The religious marketplace. Airbnb for gods. There you go. Who are we buying? Who's getting more converts? Who's better at scaling up societies? This is Jay, we were talking about the spiritual evolutionary battle, the battle for the mind share of religion, the mind share of God in people's brains. Quote, "Suppose some communities happened, by chance, to have gods or ancestor spirits that punish people for refusing to share food or for running away in the face of enemy raiders. Suppose still other communities came to share belief in gods who punish people for breaking sacred oaths taken during key transactions, such as when trading valuable goods or affirming peace treaties.
Yeah, I love that.
End
that
quote.
like, we're
Yeah.
swearing on these big omnipotent gods for these goods are really what I say they are, or that, I'm good for my money, or you're really going to get punished for this because of the omnipotent god. Athens was like their main god was a commerce god. And so like that's what like we are focused on commerce, and why do you think we've all heard about them? Henrik calls this intergroup competition, and he says that it created like cultural packages that helped expanded cooperation and good institutions. So God worrying about stealing and murder and transactions makes sense, but the worrying about the adultery is a bit weirder. Zeus was committing adultery left and right. But sexual jealousy is a major, major cause of violence in small-scale societies. I mean, like we've talked about the Yanomamo. I read one of the ethnographies. Like every other day, they're getting their wives or daughters stolen. They're going out and stealing back other wives and daughters. It's just like group on group, female sexual jealousy, left and right. Someone's always axing someone else to steal her back. And yeah, it's crazy.
It's kind of like Amazon Jersey Shore, something like that. Like, geez, dude.
Yeah, with clubs.
Yeah, exactly. A different kind of club. Yeah, and so what JD's saying, and I'm reading this quote directly from the book, like the better gods, or like the gods that are going to like create better societies, should focus on aspects of social interactions where cooperation and trust are difficult, but potentially most beneficial for the community.
Great.
So that's a quote direct from book.
Great pull-in quote. I did not have that. That was a good quote. Yeah.
There you go. A little underline coming at you with a dog ear on the book.
That's where the competition's coming in. Which God beliefs can tamp down on violence and increase cooperation. So one step up in God scaling is when he or she stops being so whimsical and starts pushing for universal moral norms. And the next big step is when, I call it they, them, how about that, becomes omniscient and omnipresent. That's a big change too. So he goes back into the historical timeline and traces it out with friend of the show, Hammurabi.
Big friend of the show. We love Hammurabi. Dude, 1776 BC. What a great year, dude.
Yeah,
Dude,
1776
give me that
BC. What a cool reflective thing. Palindrome.
Yeah. Hammurabi's got a great code. Code for your society. Very good for institutions. So Hammurabi stipulated that Shamash is the commerce god. And in one of the first urban developments, love it, dude,
Ben.
Hammurabi puts up statues to Shamash, the commerce god, in the marketplace. Don't piss off the commerce god. He's watching. So this is the evolution of omnipresent, omnipotent gods. In this case, it's the omnipotent commerce god, Shamash. So you can't break the laws of commerce in the marketplace. But I just added this in the outline last night, Jay. But I was reading the book and they're like, so what would happen is they would do business by the book and like everything would be fine in the marketplace. They'd literally walk right outside the marketplace and you'd rob the guy that you just, paid for your goods. You know
Shamash can't see.
Like, Shamash can't see out here, bud. Yeah, exactly. Like crazy.
Yeah.
But then contracts, archaeologists find contracts where two different families exchanging goods swear on the commerce gods. JD says here, he's like, Shamash watched me bag up this barley, babe. We're good.
Yeah, Shamash was watching the whole time. Swear to God, swear to Shamash. So,
dude, Hammurabi guy, he was ahead of his time, man. His code was pretty legit.
I think one of the things he even says is that he's under the supreme god. I don't know who the supreme god is. Maybe we've heard about it somewhere, but basically that's kind of an origin of political order right there, being under the rule of law. And then he mentions Athens, which we talked about. They're swearing oaths to their commerce gods when they're trading. Here's the thing, the gods didn't care about lying per se, but they cared about their honor. Just like us, they're like, you could lie outside of the realm that I'm watching and caring about, but you can't bring up my name when you do this transaction if you're lying. Quote, cultural evolution merely put this psychological intuition, personal, family, and honor to work for the larger society.
Sort of evidence of cultural evolution right there. That's what we're talking about. So we're walking through the history of the spiritual evolutionary battle of gods, and they become omnipotent. They become moralizing. They become righteous in a way. Let's fast forward 1,000 years later. All these different tribal gods are competing and getting bigger and bigger, and we're breaking Dunbar's number, and we're doing better rituals. We're at 500 BC now, and we start to get some religions with that extra little spice called universalizing religions. Buddhism, Hinduism, Christianity, eventually Islam starts to get in here.
Well, it's interesting. I think I struggled to, like, Judaism is kind of a stepping stone between universal and not, because it's kind of like their God, but he's omnipotent. He just doesn't care about your other God. You know, it's kind of interesting. And then Christianity is the one that's like, no, he really is for everybody and everything, you know, the Jews and the Gentiles.
Love that.
So he talks about the universal religions that have three things in common that are psychological game changers, our words. First, the universal religions have contingent afterlives. Like, you better stick.
Dude, I love the contingent.
Yeah.
The contingent afterlife thing is like crazy.
Yeah.
Like, first of all, in a different podcast, I think Ancient City, we talked about someone who invented the concept of heaven.
Really?
Like, that was not a concept, and then it was a concept. And like, I'm like, dude, you invented heaven, bro.
Powerful
that's
stuff.
a resume bullet point for the ages. But like,
I think Judaism is pretty ambiguous on it. Maybe they have heaven and not hell or something, but maybe they have hell and not heaven. There was something where it was kind of vague. And yeah, so Christianity, you know, starts, but Buddhism and Hinduism start like, if you either don't want to burn in hell or be reborn as a worm, you better follow these norms. So that's pretty good for, you know, adherence to norms. The second psychological game changer is free will.
only you can decide if you're going to heaven or hell. Mental states matter. Your intention matters. You have free will. You choose your actions.
Yeah, and God can kind of peer inside and know, you know, what's going on.
He knows your intent. Only you and God know the intent. And the third psychological game changer was universalism. You know, we're all equal. We're all endowed by our creator. This God is for everybody. And that one was a big leap
Yeah.
too. That's really what creates that spread of religion. A big religion cheat code, what JD calls it. Now we're getting God's for everyone. Your choices, your intentions will lead to a happy or unhappy afterlife, contingent afterlife. That's going to lead to more growth, less murder. Sign me up, Scotty. Like, that's great, right? Like, yeah.
Beam me up, Scotty, with sign me up. That's pretty good.
Dude, it doesn't get us to weird psychology, though, but it does get us on the track. It's the start of the first millennium of the Common Era, and universalizing religions are competing, mutating, and spreading around the old world. What would happen if cultural evolution harnessed the power of one of these new universalizing religions to undermine and then transform the most fundamental of human institutions, those related to marriage, family, lineage, identity, and inheritance?
Bam.
End
Yeah,
quote.
so those are like the real things that take us into the modern psychology that we currently have, is these big religions then harness the power over our norms and beliefs and then changes our human institutions like marriage and family and identity. And that's what brings us to part 2, the origins of weird people, and chapter 5, weird families. The little subheading I put in is dissolving the traditional family. So, like the last quote showed, Christianity is mutating and evolving to kick Thor's ass eventually. It's outcompeting Zeus. This chapter is all about how the church's, quote, extreme package of prohibitions, prescriptions, and preferences around family planning. And specifically, how those prohibitions and prescriptions one-shotted kin institutions. That's a good Twitter term there.
Nice use of one-shotted, dude. I saw that. I was like, dude, nice. And he calls it, I think we're going to call it out in a second, but the church's marriage and family plan. So it's not something that the church like got in a room and said, hey, we're going to like change the way that people get married and it's going to affect the culture and it's going to make it better for the church. But like all these little decisions.
Cultural evolution, hundreds and centuries of like, can't do this, you can't do that, making rules around marriage and family planning. That's what sort of broke apart these strong, because dude, all of society was your religion is based on your family. And so the entire power structure of ancient society was your kin group, your family, right? And so if we're going to create societies, we have to sort of change the way that you relate to your family, because you're just otherwise every family's just going to hate every other family forever. Your
you know
clan, this is like ancient city, your clan owns its territory collectively. Like you don't own land, you don't have individual property rights. The clan group does. The clan is the police, it's the judicial system, it's your insurance policy, it's your local hospital. And this is a good little tidbit. Only males without living fathers had full legal rights. If your dad's 90, he's still your boss. And he's your wife's boss, he's your kid's boss. Imagine developing, innovating anything. Like, I'm going to grow this because I think this crop is better. They say science proceeds one funeral at a time. You're not moving very fast when your father's telling you what to do until he's 90.
Dude, that's a pretty dark. I haven't heard that funeral one at a time. Science proceeds, dude. Whoa, bringing the heat in there.
Well, I mean, yeah. When you think about it, people are like evolution and stuff. No, that's bullshit. So those guys have power, and then how are you going to upset them when they have tenure? Just takes a while.
And the point is we're in this ancient, where your dad is your boss. He's the only like citizen of the community. Everyone else is like part of the dad family. There were ways to sort of keep your lineage going. Like you would marry your cousins. You need to keep the land in the family. Yeah. And so a lot of these marriages weren't because you love her so much. It was because we need to keep the land in the family. And, hey, daughter, I need you to marry your cousin so that our land stays with our land. And you don't go outside the tribe and marry someone else. And now we got a new tribe coming in on our land. So it was this way, this family kinship institution way of keeping the lineage growing forever that people use.
Yeah, that the Christian church kind of got in there,
smashed it,
and changed it. Yeah, he talks about how like in Islam, there's some way of inheritance where daughters would have to marry their paternal cousins, cousins on the paternal side or whatever. There were just all these rules, and that's what Christianity kind of upset. So we're going to enter back into the historical timeline in 597. Pope Gregory I, which, side note, if you want to do some cousin marriage upsetting, make your name Gregory, your pope named Gregory. All the Gregorys are doing cousin marriage laws. This is Gregory I. We got Gregory VII was the big one in Origins of Political Order. So this was great. And once again, it's so cool that we have records of this just because, our religion is based on a book. Therefore, if you want to follow this religion, you have to be somewhat literate. So the monks are now writing letters to each other, and we have records. That's just like makes this book so much richer, is the fact that these people are just writing shit down and we can actually read it. So Pope Gregory sends a delegation. This is 597, like smack dab in the dark ages. So he sends a delegation with some marriage policies to the very non-Christianized Anglo-Saxon kings in England. And what he's telling them is you can't marry family members, you can't marry children, you can't marry multiple women, you got to be monogamous, whatever. And the Anglo-Saxons are like, the f*** is this guy talking about? So the Catholic, what? Yeah. Are you sure? And so the delegation writes back to the Pope, and this is so great. This is juicy.
This is insane, dude. This is such good juice. Wait,
we need to be clear about some things. Like, can a man marry his stepmother? Can you marry a second cousin? That's kind of that's a gray area. And then this is the best one. Can a man receive communion after a sex dream? So we've got dark age popes praying for guidance about wet dreams and communion receival.
Dude.
And he's thinking about the book, and it's crazy.
Dude, how big of a problem is that if that gets bubbled up to the letter you're writing to the Pope? Dude, that's not a one-off. This is an
we got a lot of guys having sex dreams here, and we got to know for sure if we can give them communion. I love that too. I want you wonder how it would that be private, or do you think the guy is the king asking that delegation in front of the whole well, I'm having sex dreams. What about you guys? They're like, hell yeah, we are.
Dude, it's a big price. Should I still have communion today? Should I come back tomorrow? Yeah. Oh my God, that's so funny.
200 years later, so this is 800 AD, another papal commission goes back to England, and they're going to assess the progress of these marriage norms, like can't marry your cousin, you can't have communion after a wet dream. There's still a lot of incest and polygamy.
Which there is, but I just got to call it out, dude. It's so the Pope sent the rules to England in 600, and then he sends a delegation, a different Pope sends a delegation in 800 to see how we're doing. It's just that this is so slow. Everything is so slow. And you can't it's just crazy to me that 200 years later, we're just checking up on our, how those rules go over, you know, dude, it's crazy.
Yeah, it is interesting. Anyways. I mean, cause it would be months and months and months of travel to get there. You don't even know who's king. You don't know if it's the Anglo-Saxons probably.
Yeah.
But it is cool. It does show how
Crazy.
the church was at the center of power and trade and, like it really was the hub of Western Europe. So what do they find in 800 AD in Anglo-Saxon England? They still find a lot of incest and polygamy. I'd like to point out that the wet dreaming communion receivership rates unknown, undeclared. That's one of those statistics lost in the dark age.
But the church did create some extra rules, and they really started, again, they're coming after the kinship, the kin-based institutions, the families. And they're like, look, we're going to create some extra rules around children and which children are legitimate or illegitimate. Basically, you get one wife, and she gets to have your legitimate children. If you have any other children with other women, they're not legitimate. And more importantly, in the church's mind, those other non-children with your not wife, they don't get inheritance rights. They were not born into a legal Christian marriage, so we do not respect their rights to your property.
Yeah, and
right?
importantly, is the only legitimate marriages and legitimate children that you can pass down to are Christian marriages. So they're kind of owning the whole system of inheritance and legitimacy in that society.
Dude, this whole church marriage and family plan stuff, I don't know if you're watching Dune on HBO, like the show. It's like the origins of the Bene Gesserit, and they're like holding like genealogy lines like in their secret lair, and like, we're gonna breed only the best and the brightest. Dude, the church marriage and family plan, obviously it wasn't like controlled like in the Dune TV show or whatever, but it has the same flavor of like, if you're gonna insert yourself into a society over generations and control the marriage ritual, the marriage institution. You know what I mean? Like, that's kind of a crazy way to sort of assert dominance
into the very root of like what makes clans and societies in general. And again, so I even say, talk about plans being measured in centuries. That's funny.
Oh, wow. The little Dune quote coming in.
Because 1,000 years after this, and the church is a state, basically. Not even 1,000 years, hundreds of years. So back to the book. He's calling this whole, the church's family policies as the Marriage and Family Plan Program, or the MFP. That was a huge thing, and I kind of missed that part in the book the first time reading it. And he's like, the MFP this, MFP that. I'm like, what the hell? So we'll mostly just say it out loud, but like, this is the giant root of all the Western psychology causality here, is the church's marriage and family program. So what is that program?
Here's the little highlight list of the MFP rules. Okay, obviously we know we banned cousin marriage. That's a big sort of stipulation of the MFP. We prohibited polygamous marriage. You can only marry one person. We prohibited marriage to non-Christians. We stopped brothers from marrying dead brothers' wives or widows.
Yeah, because I like that he says this, because as far as your kin group, if you're just a node in a social network, you're the same. So if you're gone, we just swap in the brother, Indiana Jones, bam, like the sandbag, they're the same thing. Where now we're like individuals, and we have individual rights, or it's not how we're thinking, but for whatever reason, this is what the Catholic Church decided. This is what they prayed on and thought that God wanted them to do. And so now that, all these psychological effects fall out of that. So keep going.
Another MFP bullet point, we've created spiritual parents, godparents, godmother, godfather. Another big one here, we weakened kinship arranged marriages by actually asking the woman, do you consent? I mean, that's where we get the words, I do. Like that.
Do you want this?
The fact that you say, I do is like insane that you actually have to say that, like that's where I do comes from, that's crazy.
It is amazing. It is really cool to see how they're making these big leaps in historical terms of giving women rights and actually thinking of them as individuals and God's children too, where before they wouldn't be God's children, they would be like that grandpa's granddaughter, his property rather than God's child. Very cool. Yeah, the I do thing is insane.
+1 for the romantic love. Good job, church. Thank you for that. Another +1 for the Catholic Church marriage and family program. Newlyweds move out of the house and start their own house. That was a big cultural shift versus just like you stay in the house of your father. And that's eventually what leads to the concept of private property. This is my home. This is our family's home. This nuclear family, we have our own home. So another +1 for the MFP. And that's when, we're getting those little sparks of the Western concept, the weird concepts of like
conformist
individualism, property rights.
So
whole
How
thing,
did
right?
the church get people on board with this special E word, excommunication? Quote, besides the obvious problem of going to hell, losing one's soul to Satan exposed excommunicants to all kinds of pains, accidents, and illnesses during their remaining life. It was as if, I love this, through its ritual powers, the church had lowered its protective shield from around these incestuous sinners, leaving them unprotected in a demon-haunted world. I think that's a Sagan line, actually. Clearly, the church had wheeled in the heavy supernatural artillery to defend its expanding incest taboos. Powerful.
They even got William the Conqueror to build a bunch of fancy cathedrals in order to be forgiven for marrying a second cousin. Dude, that's like bro, you want to get back in here? We're going to excommunicate you. You broke the law. All right, those are some nice temples. We'll let you back in.
Yeah, that's medieval power politics. And what a great tax. You want to marry a cousin? Sure, go ahead, but you're going to have to pay for the right, and ask for forgiveness that we'll give you if you do us a special favor. Very like mafia-esque.
Quote, the accidental genius of Western Christianity was in figuring out how to dismantle kin-based institutions while at the same time catalyzing its own spread.
Yeah, so that is the European Western Catholic Marriage and Family Program, MFP, and its effects on European culture are basically, one-shotting kin institutions. Nuclear families are moving out on their own. They're having fewer kids. You're getting married later. That's probably why you're having fewer kids, because it's not arranged. You have to grow into a person before you actually decide and consent to marrying another person. The less kids you have, the more time you're spending with your kids, and it's probably a healthier environment because the woman is agreeing to be married with you. So that probably takes us to around 1000 AD-ish, and how the church's MFP affected our cultural and social environments.
We just hit the highlights of the MFP. Dude, look at this book. He's got pages of tables of the Catholic Church. Every rule they created related to how, the different rules around who you can marry and all. Look at this one. And by the way, just interestingly, 1983, Pope John Paul II, PJP2, he loosened incest restrictions, allowing second cousins and more distant relatives to marry.
Wow.
So, they went
ham.
They went a little too hard. He kind of loosened it up in 1983 after it's been the rule for 1,000 years. But whatever.
Yeah, that's interesting.
That was just an interesting one.
Also, he doesn't exactly get into why that the church did all this stuff. It's still kind of vague, and I think, that's outside the scope of what he was interested in. But there are some sort of precedents, like Roman law didn't exactly love cousin marriage. Apparently Judaism doesn't exactly love cousin marriage. He says St. Augustine apparently actually did say if we ban cousin marriage, that makes kin groups weaker, and that allows the church to spread better, whatever. But so St. Augustine kind of thought about it. Smart guy, friend of the show, probably. It wasn't like the church top down was saying, oh, this will give us more power. It's just that the church kind of stumbled on it, preyed on it, whatever culturally evolved this specific prohibitions that led to all these changes.
One little tidbit on the marriage and family program, that's where we get the term in-law, sister-in-law, brother-in-law. It stands for brother in canon law, brother in church canon law, meaning my brother was married to this woman under the guise of church canon law. She is now my sister-in-law.
Yeah, and so don't even think about marrying her if your wife dies, because under canon law, she is your sister.
Can't marry your sister.
So there's another way to kind of separate the kin groups. Good tidbit. I forgot to put that in there.
Chapter 6, Psychological Differences, Families, and the Church. Really interesting research. He does research in different communities, and he's able to determine how far away, or basically when your community, when your Western European city sort of received the MFP rules, right? Because just because the Pope says it doesn't mean your town might not hear about it for 200 years, right? And so he does a ton of studies sort of evaluating human behavior and then obviously brain function based on when you got the MFP.
Yeah, so they're looking at studies and correlating it with the rise of your local bishopric, but he's even cross-examining nations and holding, let's just do it in this nation because a lot of things are correlated inside of various nations. So he's like just looking in this particular nation state, and then we examine when, each bishopric was set up. We look at their answers on these various psychological evaluations, and then they did that for, a bunch of the countries and cities and everything. That's what's really cool to hear how this stands up in the scientific journals and everything.
Yeah, and we're talking about scientific journals in 2024. So they're doing studies in 2024, like the Asch conformity task or whatever, which is like, how well do you like follow directions, like follow a leader? And basically, when your town received the church marriage family plan in the Middle Ages, 800 years ago, determines how well people do on a lot of these psychological sort of evaluations. 2025.
The Asch conformity test is when you ask how long this line is, which line is longer, and everybody else in the study is a Confederate, I think they call it, and they give the wrong answer. And so how often do you give what you think is the right answer? If you were just alone, basically everybody would know that this line is longer than this one. But when everybody else says the opposite, how much do you conform to the group? And so that's what's like being very highly correlated to when you received the church's MFP. Quote, a millennium of MFP exposure is associated with nearly a 20 percentile point drop in people's willingness to go along with the group and to give the same wrong answer in that conformity task, and a 30 percentile point drop in people's willingness to lie in court to help a friend. So Chris has been out of the church's MFP for a long enough time that he's lying in court to not convict us of a crime.
Conversely, societies with more intensive kin-based institutions are more conformist and less trusting of strangers.
So it's hard for us weird people to imagine how differently you'd view yourself as part of a lineage, as just like one tiny fragment of a whole. And this quote from this Pakistani politician, probably, 50 years ago,
I underlined this quote in the book too, because it's such a good quote that highlights everything we're saying about kin-based institutions.
This is how we used to view ourselves, is what this guy said. So he's a Pakistani politician. It's probably the 1950s or 60s. It's a new country.
1972, at a time of national instability, and this Pakistani politician was asked about his personal identity. And this is what he said, Jay. You give it to us. What he said, he said, who are you? Are you a Pakistani? And this is what he said.
Quote, I have been a Pashtun for 6,000 years, a Muslim for 1,300 years, and a Pakistani for 25 years. And what I like to point out is he's saying I have been this for 6,000 years. Quote, he sees himself merged into a continuous chain of being that stretches back 6,000 years. End quote.
His ancestors are clearly more important to him than his fellow Pakistani citizens. Like, my Pashtun ancestors are everything to me.
Yeah.
Right? Like, Pakistan's been around 25 years, right?
Yeah, I'm a Pashtun.
Crazy
in a Pashtun, I'm like, it's 5,000 times more important than being Pakistani. And I even, when I wrote this, I was like, listen to how I phrased that. His fellow citizens. Think how naturally that seems to us to say our fellow citizens. And that's what he's saying. I don't recognize my fellow citizens to the same extent that you do, And this is what Christianity defeated. This is exactly what this banning cousin marriage you're not a Pashtun anymore, you're a Christian. It's a great example of how, quote, intensive kin-based institutions bind communities together by intertwining individuals in webs of shared identity. Basically, the Pashtun, the Muslim thing gets kind of washed away, and we're all God's children under Christianity.
This is what Christianity defeated, which is that Pashtun mindset. That deserves a Dan Carlin cannon boom after that one, dude. Like, that's huge.
So
that's
in his frame, the point of being a Pashtun isn't in your head. You don't believe you're a Pashtun and are a Pashtun. It's, do you come from this web of continuous lineage, back 6,000 years? Like, your mental state is not useful information. Quote, when relational bonds are fewer and weaker, individuals need to forge mutually beneficial relationships, often with strangers. To accomplish this, they must distinguish themselves from the crowd by cultivating their own distinct set of attributes, achievements, and dispositions. And that the disposition's a big word. Thinking of people as having certain traits, not just being certain things or classifications. That's a big bit of our weird psychology we'll get to more. Because out of all of that, what Christianity allowed to come from our Western culture is new orders, new guilds, new towns, universities. These are ways of structuring our social environments that don't take into account our lineages. And that's what couldn't exist before Christianity one-shotted our kin institutions.
Hi, this is Chris, the editor. We've decided to split the weirdest people in the world into 2 different parts. So this has been part 1. In next episode, we're going to be covering the second half of the weirdest people in the world. This will allow us to keep each episode around an hour long instead of doing one giant 2-hour episode, which can be a little bit overwhelming. So while you're waiting for weirdest people in the world part 2, you can check out our back catalog. I know we've got a lot of new subscribers over this holiday season. So if you're a new subscriber and you can't wait for more, check out the back catalog. We got some great videos that don't actually have that many views. So yeah, subscribe if you haven't, and see you next time.